The United States Civil War, Part 1, 1860 to 1862. The major cause of the United States Civil War, as we know it, is slavery. Slavery was the number one issue because it was the number one right that Southerners thought they would lose after the election of 1860. Also, when we start looking at the reasons why Southern states seceded, if you look at their secession documents or their reasonings why they were going to leave the United States from December through April of 1861, is almost all of them, well, actually, all of them do push the idea that slavery must be protected. And even the Constitution of the Confederacy, which was created in February of 1861, does protect the slave trade, although it's still, like the previous Constitution of the United States, bans the importation of slaves. So that was the number one cause. And people will argue, well, Mr. Rhodes, it was about states' rights. Well, the states' rights to do what? And the major right for Southern states was to determine how they were going to use their labor. And Southern states wanted to protect slavery. And this has been documented over and over and over again. The election of 1860 was a contentious election, and due to the results, this would lead to the formation of the Confederacy. The major political party at the time were the Democrats. The other parties like the Whigs, the National Republicans, and others were minor parties until the formation of the Republican Party in 1854. But still, the Republican Party was a developing, a little bit weaker party. So the Democrats were almost assumed we're going to win this election. However, when they met at their party convention in Baltimore, Maryland, in the summer of 1860, the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats couldn't decide on who to pick. And so they actually split. And as we all know, when a political party splits for an election, you're going to split the vote. So automatically, the Democrats were behind because the Northern Democrats, they're going to nominate Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas, a well-known senator from Illinois. Stephen Douglas was a proponent of popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas was the designer, the writer of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And in 1854, Stephen Douglas designed the Kansas-Nebraska Act to decide how Kansas and Nebraska were going to have slaves or not have slaves. How were they going to decide the slavery issue? Now, Kansas and Nebraska territories laid north of the 3630 parallel line of the Missouri Compromise, but Stephen Douglas, wanting to, or having his eyes on the presidency, said, if I can get Southerners on my side and Northerners on my side, I can become president. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act used the idea of popular sovereignty. And in popular sovereignty, let the citizens of a state vote to decide if they wanted slavery or not. What ended up happening was there was a disputed vote in Kansas, and from 1856 until 1860, you had Bleeding Kansas, a mini civil war. But when Stephen Douglas campaigned as a Northern Democrat, he said, let's keep popular sovereignty. So as more states join the Union, as the United States spreads west, we'll just stay with the idea that regardless of where they're located in the United States, those states will vote if they want slavery or not. And so really what that means is it doesn't guarantee the expansion of slavery, but it does allow for the possibility. Then on top of that, he says we also must enforce the fugitive slave law. He was trying to get Southerners on his side. The fugitive slave law was part of the Compromise of 1850 because Southerners were losing millions upon millions of dollars a year as slaves would escape to the North. And so the fugitive slave law said slave catchers can legally go up into northern states and bring back escaped slaves. Very unpopular in the North, even if most Northerners were merely indifferent about slavery, because many of them were. They were not going to openly help slave catchers return slaves to the South. So that was his platform, popular sovereignty and the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. The Southerners would unite behind former Vice President John C. Breckinridge. And being that John C. Breckinridge is a Southern Democrat and all of his support is really, really the Deep South, his platform is very simple. We must have unrestricted extension or expansion of slavery to the West. Now, obviously, there's law on his side because the Dred Scott decision of 1857 said slaves are property. a constitution protects property, i.e., the Fifth Amendment. And so it doesn't matter if states have banned slavery because, according to the Constitution, you can take your property anywhere. So John C. Breckinridge says, vote for me. We're going to expand slavery everywhere to the west, up into the north. Also, we want to annex Cuba. The United States should take Cuba, which we had attempted to do in 1852 with the Ostend Manifesto. But he says, we're going to annex Cuba, create 3 more slave states. And so he was the pro-slavery candidate. Stephen Douglas, more of a moderate. Then you had the 2 other political parties that were around at this time. One was created after the Kansas-Nebraska Act in Bleeding Kansas. The other was a temporary party, only for the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln represented the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln was a dark horse candidate when the Republicans met in the summer of 1860 at their convention to discuss who was going to be, their presidential candidate in 1860. They had a lot of names thrown around, but eventually Lincoln's name became the popular choice. Abraham Lincoln was a 1-term representative from Illinois. He served from 1846 to 1848. He was involved in the 1858 Lincoln-Douglas debates for the Illinois senatorial seat, which got his name out among some politicians in the North. So Abraham Lincoln, he will take the nomination for the Republicans. And his idea is he is a free soilist. Let's not get this idea that Abraham Lincoln is an abolitionist, because he is not. Although when the Republican Party forms in the 1850s, abolitionists are some of its founding members. But to be elected at a national office, that would have been very difficult. So when Abraham Lincoln is campaigning in 1860, he says, I want to exclude slavery from the territories, which simply means I want to exclude slavery from expanding west. He says it can stay in the South, but it's not going to expand. He also wants to increase protective tariffs. For a long time, since 1828, the 1832 Tariff of Abominations and the possible war with Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun in South Carolina, tariffs have been a major issue. The North supports them to protect our industry. The South dislikes them because they export their products to Europe. So Abraham Lincoln is pro-North all the way. He is so pro-North that his name will not even appear in many states on the ballot. So if you were living in South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, you would go to vote for president and you would see John C. Breckinridge, Stephen Douglas, and others. You would not even get the ability to vote for Abraham Lincoln. He was that disliked. And South Carolina let it be known, if this guy, Lincoln, gets elected, we're going to secede. So even before the election results were in, you could see there was a massive amount of hostility among Southerners and Southern states when it came to the idea of Abraham Lincoln becoming president. Then you had a one-time political party called the Constitutional Union Party. And their nominee was John Bell. And they were a moderate Southern position party. Remember, the Southern Democrats are like, expand slavery everywhere, annex Cuba, expand slavery. The Constitutional Union Party was basically, we've got to keep the United States together. They could see where the United States was headed. And so they took more of a nostalgic look at the laws that already existed and said, why can't we go back and just enforce the laws already in the books? The Constitutional Union Party was not about the abolition of slavery. The Constitutional Union Party said we must enforce the laws that have already been passed on slavery. Fugitive slave law. We must enforce the Dred Scott decision. John Bell floated the idea is, why can't we just go back and pass a constitutional amendment to just expand the Missouri Compromise line? Because with the Missouri Compromise from 1820 to 1854, things were good. There was harmony, as he saw it, in the United States. The ultimate goal of the Constitutional Union Party was to keep the United States together. They could see what was happening with the Southern states' reaction to Abraham Lincoln and the Northern Republican platform. And so when all is said and done between the Northern Democrat Stephen Douglas, the Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, the Republican Abraham Lincoln, and the Constitutional Union Party nominee John Bell, is Abraham Lincoln would win. And if you notice, this is really important. Look where Abraham Lincoln, which states he carried. Only northern states. Abraham Lincoln only carried 39% of the popular vote, but he would win the Electoral College due to the population and how the Electoral College is determined. He only won northern states, and that's when southern states started saying, we cannot have this gentleman as our president. And that's almost immediately after the election. Southern states, led by South Carolina, will decide we've got to leave. John C. Breckinridge, obviously being the pro-Southerner, carried most southern states. Constitutional Union Party, including Virginia, even though it had the most slaves, was more of a moderate state when it came to the idea of Lincoln being president. And of course, the dreams of Stephen Douglas becoming president were no good. He really didn't do that well. So, South Carolina announces on December 20th, South Carolina is going to hold a convention. And at this convention, South Carolina is going to discuss secession, because they've let it be known since before the election, during the election process, even after the election results. South Carolina said, we will not accept nor will be a part of the United States with Abraham Lincoln as our president. So Kentucky Senator John Crittenden, on the Senate floor, 2 days before South Carolina's convention, he holds, a Senate vote. He goes, we have got to preserve the Union. And so Kentucky Senator John Crittenden on December 18th, 1860, proposes a compromise. How can we accept Abraham Lincoln as president? Because even though Abraham Lincoln didn't make many voices about abolishing slavery, he was a free soilist. And, many Southerners felt he was an abolitionist in disguise, which he really at the time wasn't really. And how can I satisfy Southerners who are afraid that they're going to lose what they consider their way of life, using slave labor to produce cheap raw materials? So to get around the Dred Scott decision, which said slaves are property and slaves can be taken anywhere in the United States, the Crittenden plan, or the Crittenden Compromise, says the United States should add a constitutional amendment to reestablish the Missouri Compromise line, to reestablish the 3630 parallel line that had been law since 1860 until 1820 until 1854, which said, if you look at the map, any future states below the 3630 parallel line would be slave. States created north of the 3630 parallel line would be free. And this constitutional amendment would preserve the Union, preserve slavery in the South, preserve free white labor in the North, and keep the United States together. And Southern states were not willing to compromise on this, especially South Carolina. They immediately said no. Because although it would preserve the Union, as some Southern states saw it, if you eliminate the Dred Scott decision, then you are eliminating the possibility of expanding slavery, just like if you eliminate the idea of popular sovereignty. So this was rejected. The Crittenden Compromise, which said, add a constitutional amendment, reestablish the Missouri Compromise line of 3630, slavery to the South, freedom to the North, keeps the Union together. It was rejected. And as planned previously, on December 20th, 1860, the South Carolina government legislature holds a meeting, a convention as it's called, and the politicians of the major elected politicians of South Carolina vote, and they vote to secede. And you can see the announcement at the Charleston, South Carolina Mercury. The Union is dissolved, the Union meaning the United States. And in the secession document, because they actually have to have their reasons behind it, really it says the Union now subsisting between South Carolina and the other states under the name of the United States of America is hereby dissolved. It is ended. It is over. And what ends up happening is it's led by South Carolina. And then you have the other deep southern states of Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas. Eventually, the Deep South, they are going to meet in Montgomery, Alabama in February of 1861. And they are going to create their Confederate Constitution. They are going to choose, because they didn't really have time to elect amongst all the people, they were going to choose their president and vice president of this new Confederacy. And so they meet and they will write their new Constitution. And in the Confederate Constitution, there are many things similar to the United States Constitution, but slavery is specifically protected under the Confederate Constitution. The importation of slaves is still banned, but the slave trade is protected. Now, Jefferson Davis is what they call a gentleman planter from Mississippi. He went to Montgomery, Alabama, because he went to the United States Military Academy, and he had some military experience, not a lot, but some. And he understood that the United States was not just going to let the South go. So he went to Montgomery, Alabama, because he wanted to become a general, to be in charge of a large group of soldiers when the war comes. He goes, I can contribute to this. That my contribution is I have experience. I went to the United States Military Academy. Also, doesn't hurt that he is a very wealthy man. Make me commander of a Confederate army. He did such a good job at talking to all the different politicians, trying to get them to support him becoming an army commander, that they ended up choosing him president of the Confederacy. He reluctantly takes the job, and under the Confederate Constitution, presidents only serve one term of 6 years. So Jefferson Davis is chosen or selected president of the Confederacy. The one thing he did know, and he told the people there at Montgomery, Alabama, now we've got to prepare for war. There was this assumption amongst many Southerners that the United States would let them go. The United States would not put up a fight. Jefferson Davis, on the other hand, very shrewdly said, they're not going to let us go. Lincoln has said that. Even though Lincoln is not technically president yet, he has already said it many times, as he cannot, as his role as president, allow the states to secede. So we've got to prepare. And so Jefferson Davis would serve as president. Alexander Stephens of Georgia would be selected vice president. And Alexander Stephens and Jefferson Davis did not get along at all. In March 4th, 1861, 5 months after the election, back then it was 5 months from the election of November to the inauguration in March. Now it's January. They moved up the inauguration date. March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln gives his inaugural address. And he has a really important duty in this inaugural address, because while he is talking to the Northerners who supported him, he is also talking to the South. And he says many things in his inaugural address about, this impending war, this impending crisis. And so, in order to alleviate the fears of the Southern states and to hopefully avoid a civil war, he promised not to interfere with slavery where it already exists. So he doesn't say, I want slavery to expand everywhere. He says, look, slavery already exists in the Southern states. I will not interfere with it. Because what he attempts to do in this speech, in this address, is he attempts to preserve the Union. He has to keep the United States together. That is his number one priority. His number one priority throughout the war, from 1861, from the firing of Fort Sumter, to Lee's surrender at Appomattox in 1865, his number one goal is to keep the United States together. In this inaugural address, he tells the South, look, I will not interfere with slavery that already exists. My job is to preserve the Union. Abraham Lincoln tells Southerners, you cannot secede from the United States. The United States is not a bunch of sovereign little countries that can do what they want to do. We had that under the Articles of Confederation, and that proved to be a disaster. The United States is one nation. You can't join the United States when times are good and reap those benefits. And then when things happen that you don't like, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go home, I'm not going to play. That doesn't happen. So this is your chance. Here is the olive branch. I'm putting it out there. But if you don't come back to the Union, we will use force to bring you back. And when we use force, we're going to bring you back. Then we'll decide the slavery issue. But he has to really remember, the North was every bit as racist as the South. He has to kind of walk a tightrope about why are we eventually going to fight this war. And early on, it was to preserve the Union. Then eventually, within about a year, in the back of Lincoln's mind is, all right, now we've got to make it more than just preserving the Union. But his inaugural address is a warning to the South. I don't plan to change things, but if you are willing to still, leave the United States, I got to bring you back by force. By April of 1861, you had the Deep South had seceded. Virginia is still loyal to the Union at this time. But what happens by April of 1861, most of the military commanders that were in the United States Army from the South had resigned and joined the Confederate Army. Most of the forts and bases under the United States military in the South were abandoned, taken over by the Confederacy. The only fort left in the Deep South under Union control was Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter was far out in Charleston Harbor. It was built after the War of 1812 to protect the city and harbor of Charleston. Fort Sumter was manned by Union Major Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson had about 100 men under his command at Fort Sumter. And there was weeks of negotiation. What's interesting is when Abraham Lincoln takes his inaugural address in March of 1861, the Confederacy actually sent ambassadors, like dealing with a foreign country. The Confederacy actually sent ambassadors to Washington, D.C. to arrange the purchase of Fort Sumter. And Lincoln said, go home, go back. You don't exist. The Confederacy does not exist. So after failed negotiations on April 12, 1861, in the middle of the night, the Confederacy, led by PTG Pierre Toutant Beauregard, would order the firing or the attack on the Union troops at Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander, told his men, just stay in the bunkers. They're going to bombard us. Eventually, the 100 Union soldiers said, the heck with this, and say they actually start firing back. And they only fired back at gun emplacements. The Union soldiers could have fired on downtown Charleston and started a bunch of fires, but they didn't want to escalate this thing. Eventually, after about a 24-hour bombardment and fight, the Union Army is out of ammunition, the fort's on fire, and eventually they will surrender. And this is a great victory as Southerners saw it. They thought, hey, we have defeated the Union installation at Fort Sumter. This is the start of the Civil War. There's no turning back. There is no peaceful negotiation. The Confederacy attacked, bombarded a Union installation. Although no men on either side were killed in the first battle, during the battle, this was the spark. The Confederacy actually let the Union troops sail back up to the United States and they were greeted as heroes. But now the war has begun. So, what does Lincoln do? What is Lincoln's reaction in April of 1861? Fort Sumter's been attacked. The Civil War has begun. So as president, he is going to use his executive power as commander-in-chief. He is in command of the armies and navies. The Congress automatically declares war. Congress can declare war. That's their role. That's their power. It's actually the president's job as commander-in-chief to orchestrate the war or fight the war as they see fit. So many people felt that this was going to be a one-battle war. The United States would defeat the Confederacy in one battle. The Confederacy would come back. So in April of 1861, Abraham Lincoln calls for 75,000 men to serve for 3 months, because all we're going to do is meet in Washington, D.C., and we're going to march to the Deep South. And once we start marching an army to the Deep South, the Confederacy will give up. He also suspends the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is, if you are arrested by the government, they must tell you your charges, you must be sent in front of a judge, and you must have a trial. Suspending the writ of habeas corpus means that the federal government can arrest people they think may be supportive of the South and just hold them in jail indefinitely. And so there was this idea that Lincoln did get some of your rights violated, but during a time of war, especially an internal conflict like this, we've got to make sure that people that may be sympathetic to the enemy are held in prison. And we can hold them indefinitely. After Lincoln calls for 75,000 men, that's when Virginia has to make a decision. And so we call this the secession of the Upper South. You can see from the map The dark gray represents the original 7 southern states that seceded from December of 1860, led by South Carolina, through February of 1861. These are the deep southern states that met in Montgomery, Alabama to form the Confederacy, to select Jefferson Davis as president, to start the early development of Confederate armies. This was the Deep South that attacked Fort Sumter. But then after Lincoln calls for 75,000 men, the Upper South will secede, led by Virginia. Virginia will secede, saying we cannot support the United States government using our soldiers marching through our land to attack other southern states. So Virginia would secede after the Battle of Fort Sumter. After that occurs, the capital of the Confederacy is moved from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia, which was one of the largest cities in the Confederacy, but way behind northern cities. Remember, the Confederacy doesn't have a lot of large cities because as an agricultural society, they just need cities to help ship out their raw materials. They don't really need to make anything. Northern cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago were getting bigger and bigger and bigger due to industrialization. So the Confederate capital is moved to Richmond, Virginia. Then the people of Western Virginia, the 50 counties of the western part of Virginia, if you've been out to current-day West Virginia, it's more mountainous, it's smaller farmers. The western part of Virginia didn't have a lot of slaves. And so after Virginia secedes from the Union, the 50 counties of the western part of Virginia, they meet, and they secede from Virginia. And in 1863, the state of West Virginia would be created. All of this before the first land battle that everyone assumed would be the first major and last major battle of the Civil War. So you do actually have slavery in the North. This idea that all the slave states went to the South is not true. And that's why when you evaluate the Emancipation Proclamation, it's a balancing act between northern states with slaves and the South and their issue with slavery. And so Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, they are technically slave states. And they will remain loyal to the Union because a lot of the states fall 50-50 or don't really have a lot of slaves law, but are technically, they still have legalized slavery. Missouri, for instance, was a free-for-all during the Civil War. It's 50-50. It was really what you consider the Wild West. Maryland, that was a southern state, and you had to, even Union troops had to watch kind of walking through Maryland. Delaware, on the other hand, only had about a couple hundred slaves when the war began. So there were border states that remained loyal to the United States. Now, what about the battle plan? The gentleman on the upper left is Winfield Scott. He had been in the United States Army since the War of 1812. By 1860, he was quite old. He was overweight. People felt he was quite feeble. But Abraham Lincoln will ask him, okay, what's your battle plan? And he will create a battle plan which actually will be successful. But he said, you're going to need X amount of troops. And there were so many soldiers that were asked for. They go, oh, Winfield Scott's insane. We don't need that many soldiers. But Winfield Scott's plan was very, very simple. He said the United States Army needs to get a large army, march out of Washington, D.C., and capture Richmond. If you capture Richmond, Virginia, that'll mean the war in the East, which means east of the Appalachian Mountains, would go to the United States. Then in the West, besides attacking Richmond in the East, according to Winfield Scott, in the West, the United States Army has to capture the Mississippi River. If you capture the Mississippi River, the South will be split in half. And then the final thing, when the Confederacy forms, they have no navy whatsoever. So Winfield Scott says the United States should utilize their navy and blockade the South, suffocate it. And so this was referred to as the Union's anaconda plan because the anaconda, the snake, suffocates its prey. Now, some of the drawbacks of this plan that hurt Winfield Scott and people forced him to retire thinking he was feeble is, well, how long should this plan last or how long will it take? And he goes, 3, 4, 5 years. It's going to take time. It's going to take time to suffocate the Southern economy. It's going to take time to raise the soldiers, attack and occupy. Or really to raise the soldiers? How many soldiers do we need? I'd say over 1 million. Like, oh, you're nuts. You're insane. We only need to have one major battle. And eventually, as time goes on, especially by 1862 and 1863, the United States realized, yeah, Winfield Scott was on the right track. He actually had made a good battle plan. But unfortunately for Winfield Scott, being a commander of 50 years of experience, he says a fight like this is going to take time. And of course, no one wants to hear that. How does the Confederacy have to fight? They just have to fight defensively. As long as the Confederacy has a functioning government, a functioning army on the field, they're winning this war. Also, if you look at the advantages and disadvantages, the Confederacy can never put as many soldiers into the field as the North can. And so the idea is, if you're trying to attack your enemy, it takes more soldiers to do that. But if soldiers are defending a position, it takes two soldiers attacking to dislodge one person defending. And so as the Confederacy defends more and more places, it can survive. So the Confederacy just has to fight defensively. Now, we look at advantages. A modern war, which this will turn into, the first modern war, the advantages favor the Union, but this will take time. It doesn't happen overnight. Just as Winfield Scott says, the Anaconda Plan is probably going to take about 3 years before you really start seeing some effects of it. Same thing with the advantages of the United States. The United States, for instance, their population, 22 million to 9 million. And in the 1860 census, out of that 9 million, 4.5 million were slaves. And remember, we know this because part of the Great Compromise was the House of Representatives. House of Representatives is based on the state's population. The South had the Three-Fifths Compromise. So the South was meticulous in counting their slaves. When you actually look at men of fighting age between the ages of 18 and 45, the North had 4 million men they could use. The South had 1.5 million men. So the South was already at a disadvantage. Industry. 92% of the industry was located in the North. The only factory in the South that could actually produce railroad equipment and railroad engines was the ironworks in downtown Richmond. That's one reason why they made it the capital. They had to protect the ironworks in Richmond. But 92% of the industry is in the North. That means making guns, bullets, clothing, and most especially at that time, boots and shoes to march, all in the North. Railroads, 60% of the railroads are in the North, and they're more interconnected, easier to move troops. The southern railroads are more geared towards getting goods to the coast. And as the war goes on, the railroads become more and more important, transporting troops and equipment quickly around the United States. 67% of the food is produced in the North. And you think, well, the South is all agriculture. Well, the South is about cash crops. The free white farmers of the North, ever since the establishment of Pennsylvania, New York, and as we went into the Ohio River Valley and those areas, the free white farmers in the North, they grew the food in the United States, the corn, the wheat. And so when the war begins, 2/3 of the food is produced in the North. Even as Confederate soldiers are running out of food and starving, Confederate plantation owners are still planting cash crops and not transitioning over to foodstuffs. During the war, the United States government has better civilian leadership. Abraham Lincoln really learns well on the job. They have a better functioning government. During a time of war, you need a strong federal government. That is the type of government the United States has. The Confederacy has a weak government because, remember, under a Confederacy, the states were more powerful. And so the states had a lot of self-interest and pretty much ignored the Confederate government most of the time. While under the United States government, the states worked together because they had to, because it was the law. You followed the doctrine of the federal government, federal law is supreme. And also the United States had a Navy. So you look at all this and you go, well, that is in time when this gets revved up, where you start putting more and more soldiers, more and more Northerners into uniform. The industries transition from consumer goods to war products. The railroads get on board about how to function better, how to move troops better, especially food. You do all this together, it's going to take some time. So a long war favors the Union, just as Winfield Scott said. The Confederacy has to win this thing quickly because of their disadvantages of not having as many men and supplies and things like that. They can't hold out 3, 4, 5 years, but they can win quickly, and there's some advantages they do have. Number one is fighting defensively is easier than attacking. So the idea is if the Confederacy can hold out, maybe in a year, maybe in 18 months, there could be some political solution to this. But we don't have to attack. We can defend. And if enough Union soldiers are killed and wounded, that may possibly influence the North into having a political solution. They have much better military leadership. For generations, the idea was that the gentleman planter of the South, that their sons should be going to a military academy or should be active in the military. So when the war begins, a lot of the officers and commanders of the United States Army had resigned their jobs and had joined the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. There are many others. Jeb Stuart was a young officer. A.P. Hill, John Bell, who was from Texas. Beauregard had some issues. Joseph Johnston, Albert Hill. There's a lot of different commanders that did a very good job. And also, the Southerners were used to the outdoors, used to horses, used to guns. It was part of their heritage. While many Northerners that joined the Union Army were recruited from cities and small towns, they weren't used to all those things. This favors a short war. The Confederacy has to win this thing within 2 years. By 1863, if they haven't won it by the summer of 1863, they're in trouble. And that's exactly when you're going to see the war go from favoring the Confederacy, switching over to advantage Union. Now, remember, after the Battle of Fort Sumter in April of 1861, Abraham Lincoln will call for 75,000 men to serve for 3 months. And all of these men are kind of making their way down to Washington, D.C. These men are not very well trained. Most of them joined the Army real quick on these 3-month enlistments because back then there really wasn't much to do. Back then, they thought if we didn't join up, we're going to miss it. And so by July of 1861, you have 75,000 plus soldiers running rampant around Washington, D.C. They haven't done anything yet. So Abraham Lincoln says, all right, let's go. These enlistments are already up. On to Richmond. That was the rallying cry through most of the war. On to Richmond. And so in mid-July of 1861, Union commander Irwin McDowell is going to take 35,000 Union soldiers. He's going to march them out of Washington, D.C. on to Richmond. About 20 miles outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia, they're going to run into the large Confederate army of about 30,000 men. And this battle takes place in Manassas, Virginia, Manassas Junction. Manassas Junction is where railroads kind of connect. And so a junction is an important part for an army to hold. And the Confederate Army was at Manassas Junction because from this junction, railroads go to D.C., they go to Richmond, and they go out west to Winchester, Virginia. So it's an important kind of, logistical area. When the Union Army marches out of D.C., they get to Manassas, they meet the Confederate Army. Word gets back to Washington, hey, the two armies are about to fight. It went around really crazily where senators and members of the House of Representatives and dignitaries, they pretty much heard that, hey, July 21st is the day. That's when the battle's going to begin. And so what these senators and members of the House of Representatives did and other political dignitaries did is they packed picnic lunches and in their best clothes, they took carriages out to go watch the one major battle. And this would become known as the Battle of Bull Run because it happens along a creek, Bull Run Creek. And so what ends up happening is this is going to be it. Whoever wins this battle, that's how the war is going to go. The first Battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. If the Confederacy wins this battle, the Confederacy believes the Union will let them go. If the Union wins this battle, the United States believes the Confederacy is going to come back. And it's a confusing battle. For most of the day, the United States Army is winning. Then Stonewall Jackson and the Virginians, most of them wearing blue uniforms because there was no established uniform for the Confederacy yet, they will arrive and the battle will turn for the Confederacy. And so all day the Union Army is pushing back the Confederate Army, Stonewall Jackson and other Virginians arrive. They'll push back the Union Army, and this becomes a great Confederate victory. On the scale of battles, this was a small battle because battles would get bigger, more death. But it shocked a lot of people how many men were killed. A couple thousand men were killed and wounded. Like, whoa, this thing is serious. It's real now. And so what ends up happening is the Union Army, they go back to Washington, D.C. The Confederate Army doesn't pursue. They pretty much are cheering that. They take for granted. They think the war is over. Abraham Lincoln finds out about this. Okay, we've lost. He goes, okay, it's going to be more than one battle. After the Battle of Bull Run in August of 1861, Lincoln will call for 750,000 men to serve for 3 years. So already Lincoln's like, maybe Winfield Scott was right. This thing's going to take a couple years to win. And so during the fall and the winter into spring of 1862, the Union Army is growing. Put in command of the Union Army is a Union general by the name of George McClellan. George McClellan has all the pedigree. He's in his mid-30s. He finished highly regarded in his military class at West Point. He was a railroad executive, so he understood how railroads worked. Unfortunately, he proved not to be a very good battlefield commander. But in the fall of 1861 until the spring of 1862, George McClellan will create what he calls his Army of the Potomac. His Army of the Potomac for the United States was over 100,000 men ready to attack Richmond. Even before that, you almost had a real big political issue. Now, the one thing the Confederacy needs is they need foreign support. They know that they really lack a lot of the modern industry to fight a prolonged war. And so England is their target. The Confederacy wants to negotiate with England. England needs Confederate cotton. And so on November 8th, 1861, the Trent is a Confederate ship. The Confederate ship sails out of Hampton Roads area. It's sailing towards England. As it's starting to get up into the open ocean, it arrives upon the United States naval blockade, and the naval blockade orders it to stop. The CSH Trent, the Confederate ship, does not stop, so it's fired upon. The United States Navy boards the Trent and will arrest 2 Confederate ambassadors. Remember, technically ambassadors are neutral. And so people are upset. England is upset with them, saying, you shouldn't have done that. We had British officers on that ship. Technically the Trent, although it was a Confederate ship, was under the protection of the British. And so the British are like, you've done something wrong. And Abraham Lincoln has a dilemma. He's like, look, we stopped a Confederate ship under British protection. We arrested 2 Confederate diplomats. England is now quite upset. I don't want England to join this war on the side of the Confederacy. And if we push this too hard, England may join the Confederacy. So how does Abraham Lincoln get out of the Trent affair? He apologizes. He apologizes to the English, saying, it's our fault. It was a ship that was a merchant ship. It was not a Confederate battleship of that type. We shouldn't have arrested those diplomats. And so Lincoln will release the diplomats, and they will go off to England. England would never join the Confederacy. England had banned slavery in 1807, and the English public just would not allow their government to openly buy Southern cotton, even early on in the war, because the English people realized that this war was more than about preserving the Union. It is also about slavery. And so what ends up happening is tens of thousands, even 100,000 English textile workers lost their jobs because England was low on supplies of cotton, but these workers would not allow their government to support a slave state. Eventually, England would find other sources of cotton, like in India and Egypt. And so this cotton diplomacy really didn't work for the South. As Lincoln would say in December as he apologizes, only one war at a time, please. Now, the first Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861, it was a Confederate victory. Then, like I mentioned, George McClellan was put in charge of the Union Army in the East. George McClellan would raise a Union Army of 100,000 men, and he wouldn't do anything with them. So eventually Lincoln goes to George McClellan and says, look, if you're not going to use the army, I'll use it. And so in the spring of 1862, starting in March, it's called the Peninsula Campaign because between the York River and James River, the peninsula, starting way down by Hampton Roads, the Union Army will march up and they'll get within 9 miles of Richmond, Virginia. The Union Army in the spring of 1862 could see the church steeples on Church Hill. Why on Church Hill? Because it's on a hill. You can see it. Robert E. Lee, for the first year of the war, was simply a military advisor to President Jefferson Davis. Robert E. Lee was actually given the chance to command the United States Armed Forces during the Civil War, but once Virginia seceded, Robert E. Lee, whose family has a long history in Virginia, he will say, I cannot draw a sword against my own state. And Robert E. Lee would go to Richmond, where he would advise President Jefferson Davis. And in the spring of 1862, out of an act of desperation, Robert E. Lee takes command of the Confederate Army protecting Richmond, and he will defeat the Union Army. And then to take pressure off Richmond, Robert E. Lee will march his Army of Northern Virginia, because Robert E. Lee lives in Northern Virginia. Robert E. Lee will march his Army of Northern Virginia up. And once again, in August of 1862, it's the second Battle of Bull Run, which the Confederacy will win. And the next step is Robert E. Lee says, well, look, we're low on supplies. Also, maybe if we can win a battle in the North, maybe we can get England, we could show England, hey, this thing can be won. And so after the second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862, Robert E. Lee is going to march his Army of Northern Virginia, his Confederate Army, up into Maryland. And right as they cross into Maryland, although a southern state, in a sense, it has slavery, Robert E. Lee assumed when his Confederate Army would march into Maryland that they'd be cheered as heroes, but they were pretty much ignored. Right as his Confederate Army marches into Maryland, he is greeted by George McClellan. George McClellan, his role at this time was to just kind of shadow Lee's army, and McClellan had been given orders by Lincoln, stay between Robert E. Lee and Washington, D.C. Don't let him get towards Washington, D.C. And Antietam, the two armies just kind of bumped into each other. Just that's always the case. And both armies said, well, this is where the battle's going to take place. Antietam's a small little creek right next to the town called Sharpsburg, Maryland. And what's interesting is there's a picture of George McClellan, the commander of the United States forces of Antietam. George McClellan was accused of having a case of the slows, which means he could raise a great army, which he did. He could organize it really, really well. But when it came to commanding, he was always slow to the punch, slow to move his men, slow to make decisions. And so a day before the actual battle, a Union soldier just around Maryland, around that area, he found a bunch of cigars laying on the ground. It's like, awesome, cigars. And he unwraps the cigars, and the paper around it was Lee's orders. George McClellan, 24 hours prior to the Battle of Antietam, had gotten information of exactly where Lee's armies are, how they were split apart, and had he acted quickly, he could have annihilated Lee's army there in Maryland before the other Confederate armies arrived. And what did McClellan do? He waited. And he waited. And what ends up happening is the bloodiest day of the war. In September 17th, 1862, is a one-day battle. And really what happens in that one-day battle is you have old school battle techniques where you have the Confederate Army on one side, the Union Army on the other, and all day they fight. And when the day is over, you have over 20,000 men killed or wounded. It's the bloodiest single day. Not the biggest or bloodiest battle, because some battles take place over a series of days. This is the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. This picture you see on your screen right now, this is the first known picture of a Civil War battle. It's way behind the lines. The picture on the left are the horses that had brought up supplies. The picture on the right is kind of gray where the fighting has taken place, because this was before smokeless gunpowder. So what you would have seen anyway, taking a picture of a Civil War battle scene, which was dangerous because the cameras took a long time to take pictures back then, you simply would have just seen a bunch of smoke. And so The Battle of Antietam itself was a draw. The Confederate Army and the Union Army beat each other up for the day. And what ends up happening is each army was planning to fight the next day. The Union Army is getting retooled. They're getting ready to fight again. Robert E. Lee realized his Confederate Army cannot lose a battle in the North. And if they lose a battle badly in the North, they may have trouble getting back, crossing over the Potomac River, getting back to Virginia. So the night after the battle, rather than resting, Robert E. Lee would take his remaining Confederate Army, or the Army of Northern Virginia, and escape back into Virginia. And what does McClellan do? He just stays there and goes, this is a great victory. From a battlefield battle, the Battle of Antietam was a draw. No army defeated the other army. Politically, this was something Abraham Lincoln had been waiting for quite a while now. By the spring of 1862, about 8 months into the war roughly, Abraham Lincoln had decided that the war must be more than just preserving the Union. He says, I'm going to free the slaves, or at least make the abolition of slavery a war aim. But he knew he could not issue this doctrine or proclamation until the Union actually looks like they can win this thing. If the United States is losing every battle, next battle, then what it's going to look like is it's an act of desperation. But if he can have the proper battle to announce this, a victory, then that'll motivate, okay, we see it now. Good job. We can win this thing. Let's ban slavery. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation just didn't develop overnight. Remember, when the war begins in April of 1861, the stated goal by Abraham Lincoln, as he had stated in his inaugural address in March of 1861, was to preserve the Union, to bring the South back. So there really was a question of, well, what happens if the Union Army comes upon slaves, or slaves escape from their local masters and join in with the Union Army? Some members of the United States Army said, well, we got to send them back. That's not our role. The role is to bring back the South, not to deal with slavery. So what ends up happening is the picture on the lower right is General Benjamin Butler, and he is an abolitionist. He is stationed down in Hampton Roads area because almost immediately the United States Navy and Army kept a base called Fort Monroe down by Hampton Roads. And in August of 1861, some local slaves near Fort Monroe, they said, well, the Union Army is 10 miles away. If we can make it to the Union Army and escape, if we get to the Union Army, we'll be free. And so that's exactly what happened. And so what's interesting is that the United States government also started slowly going after the issue of slavery. In August of 1861, Benjamin Butler had his first group of slaves arrive at Fort Monroe. And since he was the commander there, people said, well, Commander, we got to send them back. This war's about preserving the Union. And he goes, remember, I'm an abolitionist. I'm not going to send them back into slavery. So what he is going to do is he's going to call slaves contraband. So if you ever see a movie or read something and it refers to slaves as contraband during the war, that's really important. Because contraband is anything that can be used by your enemy to help them in a war. And so Benjamin Butler says, well, I'm not sending slaves back into slavery. What they are is they are contraband. They're helping the South, whether it's producing crops, whether it's building railroads or roads, they're helping the South. So as contraband, we can seize them. And so that got around any issues of, that's our job is to preserve the Union. And so that is the first time where the Union, in a roundabout way, makes it clear in small groups that they're going to allow slaves to stay free. The United States Congress, on the other hand, they too make small inroads towards banning slavery. August 6, 1861, Congress will pass the first Confiscation Act, which simply says all slaves who fought or worked for the Confederate military were freed. Now, obviously, it's talking to slaves still under control of the Confederacy, but it is trying to undermine the war effort for the Confederacy, because what can happen is now you would have slaves who are working for the Confederate military. They would escaped to the Union and said, well, I was working for so-and-so's army. Okay, you're freed. Under the First Confiscation Act, you're free. If you weren't, you're contraband. You're still free. Then on April 17th of 1862, you have the Second Confiscation Act. Slaves and civilian and military Confederate officials shall be forever free. And these were only areas in the South occupied by the Union Army. Because this idea that the South was fully free of Union troops was not true. The Union had pretty much started to control New Orleans, Louisiana, parts of the eastern portions of Georgia and South Carolina, eastern part of Virginia. So any slaves of Confederate officers, because Confederate officers are out fighting, Confederate officials are like at their state government, so other people are running their plantations. So when you arrive upon their plantations, where's so-and-so? Well, they're fighting the war. Okay, you're free under this Confiscation Act. But still, these are very limited inroads. Slaves helping out the Confederate military. Slaves of high Confederate officials. What about the idea of slavery itself? And so the Emancipation Proclamation is what Lincoln had written in the spring of 1862, and he put it into his desk drawer in the Oval Office. Like I said, he was waiting for a Confederate victory. And so the Emancipation Proclamation would be issued after the Battle of Antietam. Remember, Lincoln was waiting for a victory, and he says Antietam's close enough. It freed slaves in rebelling states. Remember, there are still border states, which are Union states who have slaves that are still loyal to the United States. So Lincoln had to write in such a way to not upset them. So the Emancipation Proclamation, issued September 21st, 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, says January 1st, 1863, all slaves in rebelling states are here and forever free. What's interesting is what most people don't realize about the Emancipation Proclamation. It actually did something before that. He said if Southern states returned before January 1st, 1863, he says if Southern states return before the Emancipation Proclamation becomes law, those states could keep their slaves for the time being, with the understanding that when this war is over, slavery would end. Now, you would think, well, what was Lincoln trying to do with that? Well, Lincoln's goal was if he could get Southern states loyal to the United States again as quickly as possible, that would undermine the war effort, make the war shorter, and end the war. Now, he knew all the Southern states were going to reject that, but he gave an olive branch saying, Southern states, if you hold a convention and you have a loyal government and send members to Congress before January 1st, 1863, and you come back to the Union, you can keep your slaves, with the understanding that one war aim now is now to end slavery, then that's fine. He knew Southern states would reject that, but he had a little piece olive branch there. So, when January 1st, 1863, the importance really is, the overall importance, besides making abolition of war aim, the number one concern right then and there was to prevent foreign involvement in the war. There was still a big fear with the Trent Affair and with the British businesses needing Southern cotton. There's still a fear that the English may recognize the South. By saying that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves residing in rebelling states would be freed, it would alleviate any fears of foreign influence, because Britain had already let it be known that they were struggling internally. Do we want to support a country that uses slave labor? And the answer ended up being no. So the immediate importance was to keep foreign influence or governments like England out of the war. So you can see the first part of the war in the East, Confederate victory at Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign, in which the Union Army attacked up the peninsula between the James and the York Rivers to get to Richmond, Confederate victory. Second Battle of Bull Run, Confederate victory. Battle of Antietam was a Union victory only because each army annihilated each other, bloodiest day of the war, and the Confederate Army decided, well, since we're up in a Union state, we better retreat or we're going to get stuck. That's going to lead Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And then in December of 1862, down in Fredericksburg, Robert E. Lee would annihilate a Union army led by General Burnside. And you can see on the far right, there's General Burnside, where we get the term sideburns. And so things are not looking that well for the United States for the first, really, 18 months of the war.